The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, which of course means making it functioning in our life, any realization that we have had. And the more deeply we practice, the more continuing practice we do, and it's difficult, but persist, then gradually, the mind begins to clear more and more. And today I'd like to share some more of the Tibetan teachings, starting with Orgyen Rinpoche, and then going on, if there's time, to his son, Mingyur Rinpoche. They have a very excellent way of expressing a certain kind of practice that is very effective and that is totally in line with Zen. And that needs to be prefaced by saying this, that traditional Japanese Zen, particularly in Japan, but even in the United States, the practice is to, quote, cut thoughts. And of course, that's been explained before as what that really means is to cut our attachment to thoughts. It also involves, when we're working, for example, on the most popular breakthrough koan, which is Mu, to just narrow our focus to just Mu. Tibetans take a different, more expansive view. And while I've worked in both directions and both ways, I find that the more expansive way is more effective in that. Well, let me say a few more things about it. Over the decades that Zen has been in America, we've had a number of unfortunate instances when recognized Zen teachers have been authentically accused, appropriately accused, and it's been recognized that these accusations not only are true, but have been true often for decades of behavior that is hardly befitting someone who supposedly has a realized mind state. And quite some time ago, John Wellwood, who is a psychotherapist and also has a spiritual practice that has been going on since his days in college, noticed that quite early on and wrote about it and spoke to the ability of a certain form of practice. And here I felt this way of working on Mu to basically prevent people from recognizing and dealing with their issues, their psychological issues. And therefore, they can pass Mu, they can get down the track with the further koans and so on. And yet they still have not expressed any sense of awakening in their behavior. And until we have been able to really make our life express from the basis of any depths of realization, it can't really be called advanced practice. Hakuin came to an awakening that he was convinced was the most deep awakening anyone had had in 300 years. And eventually found his way to Dokyo Eitan, the old man of Shoju Hermitage, Shoju Rojin, as he's called also, and was very much made aware that his so-called incredible decades deep years, hundreds of years deep, Kensho was not as deep as he thought it was. And Hakuin went on to have 19 major Kensho experiences. And according to his own writing, countless minor ones as well. This is an excellent example of ongoing practice. And in terms of Mountain Gate and our lineage here, it's absolutely essential. We have to fully realize. And if we are practicing in a way that enhances that possibility, that puts us in the driver's seat. Again, the way I was taught to work on Mu really was a process which made it entirely possible, if I wanted to do this, to elbow everything else out of the water. That I could do the practice and so-called succeed and still have all of my many issues intact and still go on behaving in the dysfunctional way that I certainly was most prominently behaving in back then. And I've been working on it ever since. As you undergo this practice and you reach a certain point where you've had some insight, then you begin to see more clearly. That's what insight is about. That's what practice is about, really, is continuing to see ever more clearly until you clearly are aware of the fundamental essence that you are. This luminous transparency, this cognitive nobody, and still you have to work on the habit patterns of greed, anger, delusion, dysfunction that you have developed over lifetimes, really. It's an incredible practice. In the beginning, it can feel quite daunting because as we begin to get deep enough in our practice that we begin to see things about ourselves more clearly, it's not a fun experience. We're filled with shame, we're filled with regret, but we're also filled with a determination not to behave like that anymore. And because we have seen it deeply enough in that way, it is possible to begin to release our tenacious hold on those behaviors. It's incredible. Once we have the experience of being able to liberate a negative habit pattern, we want to keep on going. So then, how to practice so that you don't override your innate awareness. One of the most important things as we do the practice is an openness to possibility, a sense that there's something we can realize, something we can open to, something that is worth opening to, worth realizing. And so as we do our fundamental practice here, which also we do even when we're working on koans, even subsequent koans, we extend the out breath, and we're not trying to narrow anything down. We are extending the out breath far beyond where we would ordinarily breathe out. And as part of that process, we are opening in awareness to how it feels in our body to breathe out, that physical experience of extending the out breath. We do that again and again and again. And curiously enough, that focus on the physical experience of breathing out and extending the out breath also allows an expanded awareness, which is also very important. We're not shutting anything out. We're not inviting anything in, which is also important, but we're also not shutting anything out. And we do this again and again and again. And we may be dismayed that there are thoughts running through our minds, that we forget to do the breath, that we just pull our mind back to doing it again and again and again. And each time we do that, it is weakening the habit pattern of distracting ourselves. And just physiologically, it's weakening the brain connections between the synapses that would keep things going in the direction that they were going habitually, and opens us up to new possibilities. So, you've seen this book before because I've been sharing teaching from it during the session. This is a book called As It Is, which is a wonderful title. And it is a compilation of some of the teachings of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, a Dzogchen master. Tulku, as you've heard before, is someone who is a recognized reincarnation of a previous master who has died. And his 3 sons, I think he's got 3 sons, are also recognized Tulkus, which is a very interesting family. And they are all quite deep in their teachings. And what I've read so far, of course, I've been picking and choosing, but it is also, they have an excellent way of expressing things in the Tibetan teachings. So let's start with he is quoting here Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is one of the ancestors whose name we recite. To hold the idea that it exists, and it is your true nature. To hold the idea that it exists is to be as deluded as an animal. But to hold the idea that it is nothing is to be even more deluded. As soon as we try to picture something, and our minds and our training, our whole schooling is about understanding things in a verbal and an intellectual way. But this has to go far beyond any intellectual understanding. And he also quotes Nagarjuna, who says this: freely resting is to not imagine something out there. Pervasiveness is to not bind to something in here. Unimpededness is to not dwell on some state between. It is so easy. We try to hang on to something that makes us feel safe, that we exist. And yet, in looking at it in one way, there is no safety. In looking at it another way, how can we fail? And Urgyen Rinpoche continues. Ultimately, as long as we try to imagine, visualize, or meditate, and he's not necessarily talking about what we call meditation, we still tie ourselves down. And yet that's what we try to do all the time. We're searching for some picture of our true nature that we can pin up on the wall and say, okay, that's it. There is no such thing. And this is why it is difficult, because to go into unknowing is not comfortable in the beginning. Ultimately, as long as we try to imagine, visualize, or meditate, we still tie ourselves down. As beginners, we can't help it. Initially, we do need to meditate with some effort in order to approach the state of effortlessness. It is said that, quote, the path of effort leads to effortlessness, close quote. In the middle way, this deliberate effort to meditate is called mindfulness. And this here is a defining difference between mindfulness, which is very, very popular these days, and Zazen. Mindfulness is attentive in that there's a sense of being alert, conscientious, and careful, and it is an important stage. Finally, the mindfulness becomes free from the four limits and eight constructs, and according to Mahamudra, this effort is called watchfulness. Watchfulness is like a herdsman who keeps his eye on the cattle, who pays attention to whether they drink water or eat grass. Emphasizing watchfulness entails noticing how the mind is. And that is also what we are increasing awareness of as we extend that out breath. This is an alive curiosity. And openness to possibility, as I keep saying, is I don't know how else to express it. It's a not knowing, but an openness to knowing, without any preconceived ideas about what you're going to know, what you're going to find. Emphasizing watchfulness entails noticing how the mind is. You need somebody to keep watch on that. In the Dzogchen tradition, it is called awakeness, in which mindfulness and awareness are indivisible. At this point, mindfulness and Rigpa awareness, Rigpa is awakened mind, are not two different things. And then awakeness in Dzogchen is devoid of the subtle subject-object construct that is normally retained in mindfulness. In other words, there's no somebody standing out watching, being mindful. There's no observer and observed. And it's important to move beyond that in order to come to any degree of awakening. As long as we separate these two, a me seeing or a me being mindful, we're blocking ourselves from opening to that indescribable beingness of the universe that we are. Everything has to be let go of. When the light has been switched on, now let's go a little bit further. Awakeness in Dzogchen is devoid of the subject-object construct that is normally retained in mindfulness. When the light has been switched on, it shines by itself. This is the final outcome of all the different approaches. Once the light is switched on, we do not need to do anything. Once we have opened to the indescribable, there's nothing we have to make happen. In fact, we can't make anything happen anyway. When the light has been switched on, it shines by itself. This is the final outcome of all the different approaches. Once the light is switched on, we do not need to do anything. For the light to come on, of course, you seem to need two things: the switch on the wall and the act of pressing it. Awakening is like the light that is naturally shining. This is the point at which mindfulness becomes effortless after deliberate mindfulness has faded away. In short, this is the essence. Excuse me. In short, this is the essence of the three great views: mindfulness, watchfulness, and wakefulness. It is very challenging for most people to let go of the thinking mind, to think that there is something that we have to do, that's something we have to think, that's something we have to see, something in order to come to awakening. But it's really about letting go all of that. And how do you let go of all of that? By truly focusing on the experience of breathing out with that accompanying openness to possibility, awareness, total awareness. You're quite aware of the sense of temperature in the room, of the sounds of anything that's going on, of the beating of your own heart, even when that makes itself known to you, and the various different thoughts that go streaming in and out. And you're not trying to suppress anything. You're not trying to get somewhere. It's an exploration. But we so often hamstring ourselves into assuming that there's some particular mind state that we have to get into in order to practice, or some particular mind state that we have to get into in order to come to awakening. There's so many examples of people filled with all kinds of stuff in their minds. I think here about a woman who was sitting in the Doksan waiting line during a sesshin at the Rochester Zen Center. And she'd come to sesshin out of a situation in her home where there were some family challenges. And she had managed to focus her mind during much of the sesshin. But there she sat in front of the student bell, and all of a sudden the whole catastrophe came back into her mind like a tidal wave. And then the Roshi rang his handbell, and the last person before her left the Doksan room, and it was her turn to go in. And she went in and did her prostrations and had a Kensho experience. We cannot know when such an experience will happen. This is why faith and trust are so vital in practice. It's also why persistence, stubbornness, determination is so important as well. And then the openness to possibility, that what is known as doubt, the great doubt. In essence, it's the doubt that you really are seeing reality as it really is. And so an openness to the true level of awareness being revealed, to the true reality being revealed. I think I'll skip now to Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, who gives a little bit more specific instruction about all of this. Let's see. And this is from a book called Joyful Wisdom, Embracing Change and Finding Freedom. Boy, if that isn't a title for it right now. Embracing change and finding freedom. We're all being forced to embrace change now, or at least we're all experiencing change now. There's no question that we have to embrace it, because we try to fight it. There are plenty of people out there who are determined not to wear masks or social distance, and what result of that has been that there's a tremendous uptick in cases of the coronavirus sickness. We're at 125,000 deaths at this point, and suddenly many more people are breaking records on how many more people are being diagnosed with the sickness. It's not a matter of increased testing. It's a matter of a lack of appropriate behavior on the part of enough people that the virus is being transmitted. A number of states have tried to do some opening. There's a big balance between trying to keep the economy from slipping any further down the track, and also not to endanger people. But what's been happening, particularly in Texas and some of the other states that have opened up rather rapidly, is that people have congregated in bars without masks, without social distancing. I'm not quite sure how you could function in a bar actually anyway without masks. I mean, how are you going to drink your drink? And the result is that even just one bar has resulted in an enormous number of people who were there present without masks, without social distancing, and came down with the coronavirus, which of course is lethal in not 100% of the cases, but even those who do recover from it, there's a high percentage who experience a sort of a follow-up syndrome where they're having what begins to look like permanent damage, permanent impact from having had that sickness, even though they recovered from the sickness itself. So we're faced with a need to change. And if we embrace it wholeheartedly and do what's considered the most important things to do, which are masks and social distancing, and staying basically separate in large part so as not to spread the virus, there's a chance that a vaccine will become available, although that's way in the distance at the moment, before a whole lot more people get sick and die. So here is Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche speaking of practice. And this is exactly what we're talking about in extending the out-breath in the Susok'kan practice that we teach here. Working with the activity of sensory perceptions. And that's what we're doing as we extend that out-breath. It's a combination of opening to sensory perception and that curiosity of being open to whatever might be revealed. Working with the activity of sensory perceptions is a kind of preparation for working with the restless bird itself. This restless bird is the monkey mind. The multitude of ideas, judgments, and concepts that provoke the bird to jump from branch to branch. Thoughts are a bit more elusive than flowers, sounds, or physical sensations, and those are other things to serve as more preliminary foci. There are sort of additional practices that we can do as part of our Zen practice. We can do the extended out breath, but for example, someone who's got asthma, someone who's got is struggling with pneumonia right now, still practice can take place because we can use the experience of the body, just tuning into the physical sensations in the body, independent of extending the out breath, and that becomes practice. The more we can focus and allow ourselves to experience on that. Or the practice of sound, paying utter attention to the sounds in your environment. The practice of sight. And one of the things that I've experienced in my practice when I've been, it appears, deep into my practice, at Sogenji during Sesshin, and it happens here too, whenever there's an increasing depth. Eyes are open, of course, in Rinzai Zen practice, and our gaze is about 45 degrees down, and in this case, in the Zendo, there's a brick floor. And suddenly the bricks seem alive, vibrant, three-dimensional. Well, they are three-dimensional, but when we're used to seeing these bricks there's sort of, well, okay, there's a brick floor. But when we are let go in our practice, then whatever we see, it becomes rich and vibrant. Its natural state, because we don't have a thought behind it, defining it. We're seeing the thing as it is instead of taking a photograph of it and pulling it out of our file cabinet in the mind and say, oh yeah, that's a brick floor. Thoughts are a bit more elusive than flowers, sounds, or physical sensations. At first, they rush and tumble like water rushing over a cliff. You can't really see them, but by paying attention to them in the same way that you pay attention to sounds or visual objects, you can come to an awareness of their passage. And in so doing, you can become aware of the mind through which all of those thoughts appear and disappear. In so doing, you can become aware of the mind through which all those thoughts appear and disappear. Thinking, quote unquote, as my father used to say, quote, is the natural activity of the mind, an expression of the mindscape and mind's capacity to produce anything. We can conjure up a lot of things. And not only can we conjure up a lot of things, but we can conjure up them so convincingly that other people experience them as well. There was a British woman who managed to sneak into Tibet back in the 1800s when it was quite locked down to foreigners. And she traveled all over Tibet with a young Tibetan man that she claimed was her son, who, if anybody asks, she darkened her face with grease from cooking fires and her hands and so on and so forth. And she was able to be so convincing in different activities that she took part in that people saw her as Tibetan. There are the stories of the Indian gurus who can, open their hands and there's a jewel sitting in their hands. Where'd that come from? And I have a friend who many years ago was about to go to bed with his live-in girlfriend, and all of a sudden she screamed. She was already in bed. She screamed, and he looked at where she was looking at, and he saw a 2-foot diameter spider that was so convincing that he took his pillow and threw it at it. And they hadn't been taking drugs. Our mind can conjure up a lot of stuff. And it also conjures up a lot of stuff about who we think we are, how we interact with other people, how we think they are, all kinds of things. It's amazing. And to come to some level of awakening, and believe me, there are many levels of awakening, is to begin to see through that and become free of it. And to become free of it, your life is so much less stressful. This is not to say that bad things don't happen. But again, it's important to become so free that when things do happen, we are able to respond to them instead of react, close down, freeze ourselves into some idea of what happened. Now, here I'm not talking about childhood trauma or trauma in general. It's a very, very different situation. So please don't get confused about that. With childhood trauma, there are ways to work on freeing the encasement of it in our bodies that can then open us to deeper and deeper Zen practice. But I know in my case, I needed some skillful therapists, some skillful therapy for many years to be able to reach that point. It's not a fault to go and see a therapist as it used to be considered. It can actually help a great deal. And on top of that, all the therapists I know, and I know a number of them because many of them find themselves in spiritual practice, they all say that a combination of zazen, of Zen practice and therapy is incredibly more effective than therapy alone. There's something about zazen that allows us to dare to open up and allow the mind to be a little bit more flexible so that we can process things if we end up with the right kind of therapy. And nowadays, there's been a lot of research for decades at this point into how to resolve trauma, how to help people free themselves from a history of trauma and the bodily reactions of flight, freeze, faint, or fight that they now know are how the body reacts to threat. Paying attention to thoughts, and this is very important for all of us. Paying attention to thoughts is not aimed at stopping thoughts. This is where I started this teisho. Paying attention to thoughts is not about stopping thoughts. Paying attention to thoughts in practice is about being aware that thoughts are going through the mind, like that bird bouncing around between branch and branch. And as long as we don't either try to prevent them from happening or chase them, we're still involved in effective practice. And of course, it takes some learning not to chase our thoughts and not to push them away, not to try to deny them, because that only makes them stronger. And if you are finding a challenge with a lot of thoughts bouncing through your head and you feel like you're caught in a whirlwind, then to extend the out breath, not to push them away, not to deny them, but to reach beyond. And you do that a number of times, you will find yourself suddenly without a lot of thoughts in your head. It's quite an effective antidote. But there's a way to practice to discover the mind through, not through thinking, but through awareness of thought. And Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche speaks a little bit about this here. At first, they rush and tumble like water rushing over a cliff. You can't really see them, but by paying attention to them, in the same way that you pay attention to sounds or visual objects, which means awareness of them, curious, you can come to an awareness of their passage. In so doing, you can become aware of the mind through which all these thoughts appear and disappear. And then he continues to say what we've repeated already: thinking, as my father used to say, is the natural activity of the mind, an expression of the mind's capacity to produce anything. Paying attention to thoughts isn't aimed at stopping thoughts, but at simply observing them. Like taking time to look at a rose or to listen to a sound. Taking time to observe your thoughts doesn't involve analyzing the thoughts themselves. Rather, the emphasis rests on the act of observing, which naturally calms and steadies the mind that observes. You can use your thoughts rather than being used by them. If 100 thoughts race through your mind in the space of a minute, you have 100 supports for meditation. If the restless bird jumps from branch to branch, that's terrific. You can just watch the bird flitting around. Each leap, each burst of flight is a support for meditation. And this is something that we don't realize normally. So much time is spent, so much dismay is engendered when it seems like we can't get rid of thoughts. But here is an accomplished Dzogchen teacher, which is a deep practice in the Tibetan tradition that's quite similar to Zen. Someone who has been training since he was a kid and is now in his 40s and has been training full-time, extended retreats. And then he did this pilgrimage that he wrote a book about, where he faced his stuff, including dying. And in the book, shares with us how he worked with it. So I hope I have helped you understand that the traditional way we assumed we were to practice, and in some cases we're actually taught to practice, has got some drawbacks. And that the way to work with those potential drawbacks is to do it a little differently, which I've just spelled out for you. And of course, we'll be having Sunzen this evening. So if you have further questions about that, please bring them up. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.